Welcome, students, to week 4. We're going to talk about the impact of migration, the impact on sending countries, on receiving countries, and on migrants themselves. I want to talk to you first about the materials that you're going to be reviewing this week. We're in migration theory still, and this week you're really going to read the chapters on a variety of different perspectives on impact. So you're going to look at economics, sociological perspectives, anthropological perspectives, etc. And all of those have an element of the impact conversation in them. Secondly, you're going to choose, in addition, between 3 different articles or chapters. You get to choose, you're going to go a little deeper through these materials. You'll get to choose between a Central American lens, an Asian lens, or a Mexican lens. And again, as you read these chapters, I just want you to think about the question of impact. So the question of impact is first and foremost a question of value, right? And as we said at the very beginning, there's a lot of different ways to determine value. But the most basic way that people determine value is economic value. So I want to talk about that first. The consensus among economists is that immigrants bring a little more than they cost. They contribute a little more than they cost to the U.S. society, at least. They're looking primarily at the U.S. society. And I want to say that there are also studies that undocumented immigrants also bring a little more than they cost. And there's some different reasons for that ratio for documented immigrants and that ratio for undocumented immigrants. And I'll explain that as we go through this. So what are the costs and benefits of immigrants? There's pretty much consensus that immigrants depress wages for some workers, that they come to this country and they are eager to be here, grateful to be here, and they will work for less money. On the other hand, there's also consensus that immigrants create economic growth. And this contrast between wage depression and economic growth is particularly advantageous for those who use immigrant labor, whether they're employers or people who, individuals who hire immigrant labor. Immigrants from poor countries themselves, right, that they obviously benefit. And then what is often referred to as complementary workers, workers who are not in direct competition. When we look at cost and benefits, we also have to look at what immigrants contribute in taxes versus what they consume in services. And there the picture is very different on a federal, state, and local level, that immigrants are not eligible in the United States for most federal services. Obamacare, which is our national health care program, is not available to immigrants, even if they're legal, even if they can pay for it. It's not available to them, period. So even at that most basic level, we don't make most services federally available to immigrants. And yet the lion's share of taxes are paid in federal income taxes. Of course, there's also sales taxes and property taxes, but we're looking primarily here at income taxes and at Social Security. So, on a federal level, immigrants put in quite a bit more than they take. On a state level, it evens out because it's about even, because states also primarily fund education and immigrants skew young. And on a local level, immigrants tend to cost more than they contribute. But when you average them all out, you end up with them contributing a little more than they cost. And that takes into account what is often called the cost of control. Those are not services. That's what it costs to maintain a border. Although, of course, under this administration, that's costing more than it's cost in the past. For undocumented immigrants, by the way, the vast majority of them in this country have false papers, and that means that they use a Social Security number that does not exist. There is a special fund in our Social Security Administration. Last year, it was at $16 billion. All the money that is taken out of their paychecks goes to. They will never receive Social Security benefits for that number, as it is not their number. So all of that money goes into our general Social Security system, which keeps it solvent. So for undocumented immigrants, this is an even starker comparison, that they are not eligible for any services on a federal level, but they contribute an enormous amount of money into the federal budget. And of course, they have the same ratio on state and local. In fact, they can cost more locally because they don't have access to healthcare in many places. They only go to emergency healthcare, which is very high cost. Another comparison, or another area that people look at when they talk about the question of economic value in immigrants, is they look at immigrants' higher rates of innovation, entrepreneurship, and ambition. That's not an enormous difference between immigrants and non-immigrants, but immigrants are slightly more likely to start small businesses, more immigrants create patents, that there is something about the ambition that is necessary in order to immigrate that seems to bring people that are more likely to make that kind of contribution. There's a whole dialogue around the question of job replacement, about whether when immigrants come, for example, and take very low-wage jobs like agricultural jobs, whether in fact they're pushing out Native workers or whether they're pushing them up, where the Native workers are then taking better jobs. This is a huge controversy. The data is very unclear on it. Another question when we talk about value is the difference between the initial ratio and the ratio over time. That, for example, young immigrants, particularly if they're very young, if they're children or teenagers, they don't contribute very much and they receive education, which is a big benefit. But then that education can be an investment in them that then pays out over time. So you really have to look at both initial and long-term impact when you're looking at impact. In terms of the sending country, there's two different variables that are in tension or conflict. One of them is the brain drain, that often the people who have the most to offer are the people who are most ambitious, are the people who want to get up and out. And so there is a brain drain, particularly when we talk about poor countries that are the sending countries. On the other hand, people who are here, who maintain a transnational identity, and significant portions of them do, send remittances back to the home country. So at a certain point in the history of El Salvador, the budget was dependent on remittances from people in the United States. So there's this tension between brain drain and remittances. And then remittances, of course, fund an educational system that helps to develop leaders for the country. There's also clearly a question of value for the immigrants themselves around quality of life and opportunities, which is one of the reasons why immigrants come, particularly immigrants that are ambitious. So when we're looking at the impact on the receiving country, the sending country, and the migrant themselves, we're really looking here at a question of value. But of course, value is more than economic. So when we look, for example, at the blood category, which is all about family unity, social support networks, which are created through being able to bring your parents, your children, your spouse, your brothers and sisters, that those social support networks have economic implications. If you can bring your elderly parents over, they can take care of your children. You don't have to pay for childcare. Childcare is much cheaper. You have more disposable income, etc. When someone can come over and there's an established family member already there, it's much easier for them to get a job quickly. It's much easier for them to invest in education. So social support networks actually produce economic value. But social support networks also have societal value, that when you have a grandmother with you, that children are the beneficiaries of the values of that grandmother and the love of that grandmother and the contribution to their lives of that grandmother. So all of these are non-academic factors that make a difference not only for the immigrants, but perhaps for the society as a whole, because those people can be contributors in social ways to their neighborhoods and to their communities and to their churches, and not only to their families. So those are some of the social implications of social support networks. So for example, the blood category. There are also cultural contributions that immigrants bring. one of the gifts that Hispanic immigrants bring to this country is a very strong emphasis on family values, which arguably could be said, could be, we could say that that's something that the U.S. really needs at this point, is stronger family values. Certainly as Christians, we would say that. And that's a cultural contribution that Hispanics bring. On the other hand, it's a major dialogue, right? It's a major debate, the difference between cultural contributions and cultural disruption. And that debate is very connected to how much you envision a multicultural community as a positive trait in itself. That do you believe that communities need to be monocultural in order to have strong social bonds, in order to have a healthy community, or do you believe that a community can be both diverse and united? And of course, people's beliefs on that are all over the map. But that's a major factor in whether or not you think that the cultural contribution of immigrants brings more value than it costs. Immigrants also potentially increase the possibility of international collaboration, particularly if they maintain transnational connections and identity, and globalization. That the dreamers, the people who were brought here as small children and were raised bilingual and bicultural, are very useful for a number of companies that want to do business in Latin America. So, you know, there's a net value to the process of globalization in the presence of immigrants. So these are all values that can be seen through economic lens, but can also be seen through the lens of world peace, for example, or security, or through a Christian lens. And I want to talk for a minute here about the particular Christian lens that we bring to questions of value. So there are mission implications to immigration. The average Christian in the world right now is an African woman. So the numbers of Christians have shifted. The majority of Christianity is not in the northwest of the world. It's not in the global north. It's in the global south. And so we are seeing an increasing phenomena, an increasingly vibrant phenomena of reverse mission, where people are coming here and rejuvenating churches, or starting churches, or church planting and bringing the gospel to societies like Europe and the United States that are becoming increasingly secular. So there's a reverse mission implication. When the people who are coming are not Christian, for example, you know, there have been multiple missions to the Muslim world. Those missions are very dangerous and sacrificial. But now we have Muslim refugees coming here. So the mission field comes to us. Thirdly, one could talk about the welcoming of the stranger in terms of the commandment to welcome the stranger. We could talk about it in terms of the injustice of the huge economic disparities that exist in our world that keep some people terribly poor and allow some countries like ours to be enormously rich. That there are many reasons for those disparities, but some of those reasons certainly have to do with justice and injustice. And so by supporting immigration and by responding with hospitality to immigrants, we certainly are in accordance with many of the scriptures that call for justice and that call for that kind of hospitality. And there is certainly a blessing that comes to not just individuals, but to countries when people are doing God's will. So that's a little overview on questions of impact. Just again, to sort of provoke your thinking, to frame it a little bit as you go to the materials, and I look forward to reading your contributions.